Alright, welcome everybody back to my channel, and this time we're gonna be looking how to paint skin. It's gonna be mainly for lighter skin tones like this one on the right, or maybe something in the middle like this one on the left. For darker skin tones, I'm gonna do a separate video about it because it has a little bit more nuances on the colors and how you treat it. So it needs a little bit more care there. Before we jump into looking at the process from start to finish, here you see the finished results. I'm gonna talk a little bit about theory around how skin reacts to color, and also how you guys can choose colors for your portraits, and how you can approach your shadows and so on. So I'm having a couple of slides here. Bear with me, it's not gonna be too much theory, it's gonna be just a few minutes, and we're gonna then jump straight into painting. So first of all, I think many of you are familiar with photographs like this on the left side, where you can see, for example, either hands or something else, some other material, and being directly in front of the sun, and then you see this kind of let's say red coloring around the edges here of the material being created, especially when it's skin. That means we have this effect that it's called subsurface scattering. And what subsurface scattering means is effectively it's that our skin has this kind of layers, as we see on the right, where we see, for example, that then we have the skin, and then we have the let's say blood vessels, and then comes down the bone or whatever other things are inside our bodies, right? Compared to the picture on the left, right here, the right one doesn't have this, or maybe it has the little much less, because it's more like a plastic or whatever other solid material here. So there is no subsurface scattering happening. So what subsurface scattering is effectively when we have the light coming in, the rays of the light coming in, usually when we have a solid material without any kind of complexity like our bodies, then the light won't be able to penetrate that much into the material, maybe just a little bit depending on the material. It's, for example, subsurface scattering can also happen in very thin layer of fabric or something like that. You may also see it there. And then the light just bounces off this material, so we only see the color of the material. But on the skin, since we have all these layers and light can penetrate more into the skin, then it will take the properties of the blood itself. So it will actually combine the light source with the blood of the body. And that means that instead of having these arrows here that they show how the light, bounces off, then it would do something like that. It will try to bounce into the blood, take this reddish color as we see here, then maybe bounce also back again here, of course with less intensity, so it becomes less intense, and then it will go outside. So eventually we're going to end up having, for example, a combination of, let's say, if you had a yellow light coming here, and then we have a little bit of red coming in. So if we slowly go over this, then the new light is more to the purple compared to the original one that was more to the orange compared to the original one that was very yellow. And that means the first thing we kind of need to understand is that whenever on the face we have most let's say blood, actually there's more blood in terms of vessels underneath, then we have this redness. And that shows that we have kind of zones. And maybe you have seen on the internet around that there is this images on the left where it's called face color zones, and effectively are being created by subsurface cuttings. So we have, you know, this yellow zone, we have then the red one, and we have the blue. Blue is mostly for men. I wouldn't suggest it so much for women to go there, but maybe you want to go somewhere in between like purple. And why these zones exist is because if you see the skull and how it's being, inside our body, the areas that we have the more redness is around the areas that have less of bone. So the bone being not there, so the absence of bone, like the eyes here that we have, and the whole of the nose, have also leave room, let's say, for having more blood vessels and so on. So we have a lot of concentration of blood vessels. So these are the areas on the top that we have less amount of blood vessels, because the forehead is very close, and the skin is thinner a little bit there. Then we have this area in the middle where we have more blood vessels and so on. It appears to be more red. And then effectively at the bottom we have the teeth, but we have kind of a huge hole inside our mouths, right? Because we don't have any skin or any muscles or anything there, but all the muscles are around here in these areas. So that means that we have this kind of situation that gets created because of the morphology and the physiology of our skulls. And if I kind of pick the last, let's say, colors of these portraits, you will see that this is a little bit more. And if you watch on the right here, the color picker, the color selector, and I pick here, then you will see it's a little bit more red in these areas right around the cheeks. Or if we go here, then you will see that it's going even more to the red, which is more to the blues on the left. So as we go down, pretty much we go from yellow to red to blue. And this, for example, for this specific two portraits, these areas can be looked as here, right? If you follow the skull on the left and you wanna, kind of identify which areas would be the similar areas for these two portraits, it would be these two. Effectively, that's the second thing we need to kind of have in mind when we are painting portraits, that we need to kind of create this color variation, going from more yellow areas to red areas, eventually to even blue areas, which is darker color, through the face. There is no need for this variation to be so extreme, right? But some differences play a big role. For example, starting from this and going more to the red, and then maybe even back again, depending on where the light hits and so on. So all these colors have a little bit of variation, as you can see, of color. This is what we want to achieve through these color zones. And then the other thing that also will affect your skin, it will be background light or backlight, or however you want to call it in terms of terminology, which is either the light of the room that gets mixed with the bounce light from the main source, or if you're outside, the color of the sky, for example, which is blue, which gets mixed in the shadows with the color of the light source. And that means is as we kind of go from light to dark, depending on the background, then we have this color variation starting from top to bottom. So I have a little sphere here, and I want to show you how this sphere gets affected if we kind of put in combination the color of the background with the shadow. So as you can see here, if I just pick colors from the top, and if you see the selector, the color selector on the right, then effectively we have the same right hue. The hue doesn't change, is always here in this area. It's just the color gets darker and maybe a little bit more saturated. Then if I want to apply, the color blue, these are bluish backgrounds, then I will see the following. So I just have a normal layer that I have it on, I don't know, 20% opacity. Of course, the color gets mixed. It's not full blown opacity when it gets applied to the shadows, right? And this usually happens in the shadows, because I'm going to explain in the next step why it only happens in the shadows. So if I now pick again from the color wheel, from here our screen, the color, please watch the color selector again, and you see the difference in how this is shifting to the red, right? It's going to the red. So having this in mind, and even picking from the references, you will see that the shadows colors are kind of shifting from the light to the let me pick the color picker here, right? Here you see the differences, right? This is the light, this is the shadow. It's going more to the red, or here, and here it's even more evident where we have this darker shadow here and here, right? That means that depending on the background, then the color will shift towards to the reds, if it's more to the blue side, if it's more from this blue side, or and if it's more from this side, the background, maybe we'll even shift to the other direction. Let's say another example, here is a more green, for example, color, similar, there's an opacity layer in that, and then you can see that it's shifting towards the other side. Now this is very, very basic color theory, what I'm explaining here. It has a lot more kind of nuances, and the way you can, get the colors effective. But effectively, what you need to understand is based on your background, whether it's bluish or greenish or something like that, there should be a shift of colors. And the way you can shift colors, of course, is like going from the yellow, orange to less saturated, for example, green here, or from this one again to the more bluish. Now, if you just apply, of course, the color like I have done here, you will create a non-saturated color. So it will go through green, because color on the color wheel, how it switches, it goes from more saturation to less saturation. This is more a kind of a real like from life perspective, right? How the color changes, but it's up to you to choose more on how you want to treat your shadows. Usually I'm going for more saturated shadows than less saturated, because I need to I want my portraits to appear more colorful and so on. Now you may choose, depending on how you see it, you can choose to put saturation in the mid-tones, or in some other areas. For example, here this one is has this kind of saturation, but the shadow is more saturated. But here this one is less saturated, but the shadow is still not that much saturated, but the mid-tone is more saturated. That means you want to kind of check based on whether you want to paint completely on reality, right, and have less saturated colors on the shadows, just because, of course, less light hits them, and we see color because of light. But also at the same time, think about if you want to go away a little bit from reality and start creating more saturated shadows in some areas. Now, let's go a little bit finally through what we call the different values and how this gets changed into these portraits. As I said, like, what are the different areas we want to make sure we have in mind when we're painting portraits, right? Like, we want to know, we're gonna having in mind this ball, we want to paint the light, right? And we want to paint the shadows. This is the core shadow, for example, here. And then we have what I showed you here, how the rest of the shadow gets affected by the light. For example, the light will hit here and will create what we call the reflected light. And this is what I showed you in the previous steps. So having in mind all this, like we have the light here, the light area, we have what we call the halftones or the midtones, what I mentioned here, we have the core shadow, we have the bounce light, and finally we have also the highlight here. Having all the stuff in mind, how do this get translated while I'm painting portraits, and also having in mind the first slide where we talked about subsurface scattering. Things get complicated, but we can simplify them into these following ideas. So starting with the base color, like this is the mid-tone in the previous picture. This is what we call halftones here, or midtones, right? So this is the color, as we call it, that doesn't get affected by light and shadow, right? We start by choosing the midtone, and then we do the following. We kind of paint the shadows. So if I'm picking here the color from the midtones here, the shadow is a little bit more down and shifted to the red, a little bit more saturation sometimes depending on the case, right? Then we apply the subsurface scattering, right? This is, you see, more saturated, very much more saturated, and a little bit towards the reds. And then we apply the light, which is less saturated and towards the yellow. So we are shifting from the yellow to the red a little bit, to the red, much more saturated, and a little bit less saturated for the shadow. And also now we will apply the bounce light or reflected light that was shown in the picture. So this is again, let's say lighter, but not as light as the light area. And finally, we have the highlight. So this is how we can approach portraits slowly. We're gonna create, for example, starting from yellow, going to a little bit more red, and then finally even more red here, right? So going from this way, the portraits in a more fairer, let's say lighter skin. Then we start with this lighter base color. Then we apply a much darker shadow, just because, you know, the light situation on the right is harder, and this is saturated the shadow now because the skin is less saturated, starts from a less saturated value. Then we apply the subsurface scattering. Usually this gets applied, as you can see, on the changes between the shadows and the light, or in the nose, as we show the faces, as we show the zones of the face. Then we apply light. Then we go much less saturated because we start from a less saturated base color. Then we apply the reflected light here. This area, as you can see, is even more to the starting to go towards magenta a little bit. And then finally we have the highlight, which is, you know, some areas, for example, let's see them here quickly, like this area here, or here on the nose, or here on the eyes, like depends on where the light is hitting us. For example, in this case it's hitting from here, in this case it's hitting from here, right? And this is the process in general we're gonna see next for these two portraits. While we paint them, I'm gonna show you what kind of layers I'm using through the process. It's gonna be a kind of a quickened process where I talk over the kind of the time lapse of these two portraits, and I'm going to explain how I apply all these rules that I just showed you in the slides. All right, so let's go then to see the time lapse where I will talk over and let you know how I apply all these techniques and process. Let's start then with the first portrait. And the first thing I do is I'm gonna color my line art to a color similar to the darkest shadow from the reference in order to blend it better with the final painting. So if it was black, it would have been much more difficult to blend the line art and make sure it doesn't show in the final result. Depending on your style, you wanna either blend the line art or not. The next thing is as you can see here, I'm creating color variation based on the mid-tone that I chose by going through the different colors. For example, going in the forehead and slightly going through the yellow color, and in the cheeks going more redder by using this brush with opacity. So I'm just gliding through my brush in the different areas. And for the shadows, I'm gonna start by using multiply layer. As you can see, my multiplier layer is more to the reddish side and a little bit desaturated. And I'm gonna start establishing what I call shadow shapes. So these are concrete shapes that I'm choosing based on the reference on where I should design kind of my shadows, right? Where I see shadows and how I wanna design them. These are all based on the arrow head and the planes of the face. I'm gonna have on the top right a reference of the arrow head based on the lighting environment that we have here that's coming from the top right. So you can help you see how you can identify the shadows for the specific portrait, and also at the same time having this knowledge define your own shapes. What I want to use is effectively a hard brush, as I'm using here with hard edges, and then make sure that I choose consistently my shadow areas, and I don't want to paint any let's say multiply in the light areas which are on the right. So all my shadows are on the left. Even in the middle I have painted some shadows, for example with the multiply layer, but maybe a little bit less, with less opacity. And what I'm gonna do now is try to with some layers on top, like the adjustment layer that you can see here, for example, adjust a little bit the shadows and the darkness of the shadows. I don't want to go full into the darkest shadow that I'm seeing from the reference, but somehow somewhere in the middle, because I'm going to adjust the values later, right? I'm also making sure that I'm creating a basic background based on the reference. Mainly I'm seeing what is the value of the background and a little bit the color, so I can have a reference to paint similarly my painting, right? Like if your background is not similar to the reference, then you may be completely off in your values and going to be become much more difficult to paint consistently based on your reference. Now for the light, as you can see, I'm using an overlay layer with a yellowish color. I know that is probably the wrong color at this moment, but I want to shift the colors of the light more to the yellow side, as we showed before in the theory part of this video. We want to create color variation starting from yellowish colors to the reddish colors, which are closer kind of to blue based on what we have on the color wheel, right? So I'm using this one, and again I'm choosing specific areas with hard brush where I see mainly a lot of light. This is the idea about it, having in mind also the planes of the arrow head. I'm gonna choose effectively and create shapes out of them based on what I think they are a kind of cool shapes to show in this portrait. Mainly I'm using, as you can see, triangles. I really like triangles a lot. They have interesting shapes, and also I'm gonna go through them now and make sure Some of the areas of the shapes are very hard edges, like for example when I see on the top right this a highlight on where the planes change from the forehead and head turns. This is a hard edge for me, right? It's normally not a hard edge, but how the light is bouncing here on her face creates this hard edge, but the bottom side is much softer, so I'm gonna smudge it out with the smudge tool that I'm using. There's a default smudge tool. Also, the brush that I'm using for painting is also a default brush of Krita. You can find it in the painting brushes area, painting group area from Krita. Now I'm gonna adjust the overlay when I have the shapes ready and trying closely to go more go more closer to what I see on the reference. I'm also gonna be playing around with maybe, I don't know, deleting some of the opacity, right? Whatever it brings me closer, or changing the hue a little bit to bring me closer. But I don't want to miss the whole yellowish effect that this creates. That's why I'm always being there on the opposite side of the reds. Now what I'm doing is I'm gonna create the, how we call it, the Fresnel effect, or which is very, very evident here on her left side, and it gets created from the bounce light or the reflective light that we saw in the theory part, but it's quite strong here in this reference. So I'm using this hard light layer with a very, very pale blue to attack these areas that are being affected by this reflected light. Again, I'm going to have a reference here from the arrowhead on which planes are being affected on these areas, and I'm going to paint them as I see them with as much opacity as I can and as much as harsh shadows as I can, and then I'm going to go back as I'm doing here and smudge them around, smudge the area so I can create, you know, this effect of gradient between the light and the mid-tones that I have in the skin or the shadow tones. I'm also gonna be playing around with the opacity a little bit because it's kind of too, let's say, light for my taste, and it's kind of too strong. And that's the two main light, let's say, shapes that I see. From the right we have the overlay layer, and from the left we have the harder light layer. Now what I'm doing is I'm going through the rendering phase, right? And this rendering process effectively is I'm gonna start paying attention to actual stronger shadows and also variation on the halftones. That means I'm gonna go over with a normal layer, and I'm gonna start painting areas that I see stronger shadows. And how I paint stronger shadows, I pick up the color of the specific area, and if I wanna go darker, I'm gonna go darker and more saturated and shift the color towards the blue. That means if it's orange, towards the reds; if it's yellow, towards the orange, and so on. Having in mind now, I'm combining what I'm seeing in the reference and my knowledge of the arrowhead, the skull, and the face anatomy that I know. The whole process of rendering is kind of painting throughout the whole face and looking at the details from the references, as I said, as well as correcting the values from the different planes. For example, this one, I'm gonna make it a little bit more saturated and a little bit lighter, because, you know, as the head turns and goes into the cheek and then back into the towards the jaw, then the head goes from very, very light gradually towards a little bit more to the shadow. I'm also going to be correcting a little bit the colors here. I'm going to putting some magenta tones on some of the highlights as I see from the reference. Of course, the reference has much more reddish highlights, right? I'm still in the yellow area, so I'm going to start slowly correcting the colors here. The important thing is that you want to kind of have the painting being attacked as a process as a whole, right? You want to be seeing the portrait as a whole and not really focusing too much into specific areas. Then that's why you're seeing, jumping around and going through the neck, going through the face and all these areas. I'm also gonna be blending out different areas. For example, like on the left, that I did another bounce light, or creating more variations into the shadows like I do now. For example, stronger shadows in this area, and then light on the other side, so I can create a little bit more contrast there. In this way, you can you slowly going into a more realistic view of your portraits while creating these gradients. For example, here I'm going and putting some occlusion shadows, as the neck is touching the shoulder there. Muscles, it creates this pocket of non-light. What I have to do here is making much darker, and slowly in this way creating the feeling of seeing a complete face which is 3D and it has different planes and so on. Because as you can see now, until now, we are kind of flat in different areas. For example, like the very big highlights that we see in the reference, I'm gonna slowly start picking color from them and creating variations of color, going a little bit darker in some areas, right? Not that much, not jumping into values, but going a little bit darker again with the technique of when I'm going darker, I'm going a little bit more saturated, and also a little bit more closer to the blues. Not that much of huge variation inside the highlight, but at least making sure that there is a little bit of a difference of a hue that creates the gradient in the highlight, and it seems that there is curvature of the actual face, thus making it more realistic. Excuse me. So effectively, this is what I'm going to be doing in this rendering process, making sure that I'm correcting my colors, creating gradients into the shadows and the highlights, and also blending different areas together when there is not so much difference between, and I don't want to have too much contrast. I'm also going to be going through some shadows, like drop shadows under the lips, for example, where I see that values need to be lower and the area darker, for example. I'm gonna also be painting different planes, like for example the chin here and how it's wrapping around the neck, right? So it's just a ball-like, let's say, form, where it's starting from the light on the right and wraps around under the neck. So it's gonna be slowly going darker as we go towards the line where the neck starts. Similarly, I'm gonna be painting different planes on the ear, for example, and creating more drop shadows or cast shadows or this kind of occlusion shadow. Then usually it's very dark when light comes from above, or where the ear ends and where the neck starts. So it's kind of the cast shadow of the actual ear to the neck. And I'm gonna be going through different details, for example, like the neck here and so on. Usually you would see me have a different combinations of making the line art disappear, and then I'm gonna sometimes paint over it, or I'm gonna be deleting it altogether in the end when I merge everything up. And usually I choose to paint the features like the eyebrows or the eyes or the nostrils or the lips later in the process. I want to first establish some shadows and lights and halftones, and then go through the different features like the eyes or the eyebrows. This helps me a lot in getting better knowledge around what kind of values and what kind of colors I need to put into the features, rather than painting them from the beginning and then kind of trying to correct them in the middle of the process. So that's why you're either gonna see me either putting some arbitrary values in there or not painting them at all, as it's this case with this portrait, and then trying to paint them on top in different layers as I'm doing now, because I don't want to be losing the focus of the entire portrait just because I want to focus in the features. So similarly with the hair, I'm leaving them for later in the process, which is about now, and then I'm gonna go through a similar hard edge brush and try to paint first of all the groups of hair, starting from the roots and then doing brush work towards the flow of the hair, as you can see. Then after this process is complete, I on purpose left also a little bit of areas looking through the skin just to make the hair look more natural. I'm gonna start defining some higher planes, which means that the planes that are looking more of the hair that are looking more onto the light, and I'm gonna choose a little bit of a lighter value to do that. I'm picking effectively from the value of the hair and going a little bit higher and less saturated to create this kind of variations of value. There's no need to go too much into white, although you may be confused on the ref on the left that you see, okay, there are a lot of highlights in the hair, let's go, very, very high in the values, almost to white. That's going to be wrong, because, contrast is always relative to its surroundings. And that means you want to be careful and kind of stay into the family of the values you have around, right? So even though you see me choosing very, very dark values on the color wheel on the right, you can see the actual highlights of the hair. Now I'm gonna go and put some blues or greens into the highlights areas, and that means and why I'm doing that is effectively you want to create more color variation into your different areas of highlights or shadows, and a good way to do that is to mix what would be the sky or the background color into your highlights, so they get mixed with this color and they create this kind of interesting color variations and make your portrait feel less plasticky and more like a skin tone. For example, if you see throughout and start picking colors from your references with your color picker, you will see kind of 1,000 colors. So what I'm trying to do with this technique is go through the highlights and then create this color validation by adding a little bit more blue and deleting most of it, but at least the kind of a very, very small parts of this bluish light is going to remain there and give you the effect that there are more colors there than they needed. Yeah, exactly. Now I'm going through the lips. As we said, we are kind of in the feature painting process, and I'm putting first a very saturated color onto the lips based on what I see from the reference, and I'm gonna start building the shadows, effectively having in mind that the upper lip is not looking at the light, so it has to be darker, and the lower lip has to be lighter. I'm just gonna be creating now how the lip is kind of turning inwards into the mouth and creating these very dark areas from both sides. I'm going to do this, and I'm also going to try to blend the sides of the lips into the skin to of course create the impression that the lips are kind of a continuation of the skin. It's just there's no stopping point and starting point where the lips are starting or ending, and this is usually what I see most beginner artists are doing as a mistake. There's a clear difference between where the lips are starting and where they are ending, unless it's kind of your style in terms of you're following this consistently and on purpose, where you do, lines on your lips. You don't want to have lines in the areas where the lip ends and where it starts. You want to make sure that there is a kind of a gradient between the two. I'm doing also now the highlights of the lips. I'm gonna be choosing a less saturated color for this and a little bit closer to the yellows, and also the same highlight on the bottom side of the skin between the lip and the skin, which is usually a highlight that you will see starting in the skin, between the lips and the skin on the bottom lip if the light source comes from above. Yeah, and now we're going into a mode that I have a lot of features down, and I'm gonna also try to correct a little bit more other stuff that I'm seeing around. For example, darker values on some of the shadows, or for example, painting the eyes inside. As you will see me in a little bit with the eyes, I'm gonna explain a little bit what I'm doing. Is effectively, if you remember, in the previous video we were talking about the eyes, and we are saying they are kind of balls, right, where the iris sits on, and that means you want to make sure you kind of give this impression to the viewer that the eye on the corner is turning into the skull, and that means it becomes darker in the corners, either on the left side or which is the eye drop for the right eye, or on the other side. So both corners kind of gradually want to go darker in order to create this feeling of having a ball that sits the iris on. And then we're going now into the eyelashes. After having the eyes done, I'm not gonna attempt to replicate the eyelash at all. I'm just gonna create the a strong line on the both sides of the eyes, and create this kind of triangles that go from this line towards outside. I'm gonna go deep dive more into the features in a future video. Let me know if you want to see that in the comments, but effectively the whole idea is you don't want to go into detailing every single eyelash, but you're gonna just give the impression by having some lines starting from the eyelid and going on above, and creating this kind of triangle to be perceived as eyelashes. I'm zooming in a little bit to paint the eardrop and the different planes of the eyes. Like we have the eyelid, the above eyelid, and the eyelid below, and they have their planes. And also I'm gonna choose this very, very pale, almost white color to create highlights and some drops on the eyes in the eyeball, which they give the impression of watery eyes. It's kind of a stylistic choice. You can either do it or not, depending on if you want to put so much detail into the eyes. And I'm gonna again zoom out, keeping in mind that I need to be seeing all the portrait, and I'm gonna smooth out the starting points of the hair so they can be seen as being kind of growing through the skin. Now with the soft light layer, I'm gonna enhance even more the redness of the face by looking to exaggerate the subsurface scattering, where I have mid-tones, or where I have transitions between shadows and light, like in her back. And also I'm gonna enhance a little bit the highlights by creating almost white highlights in these areas, but deleting most of it, right? Like I don't want so much white in the portraits. I just want to create some focus areas by choosing almost white as my color, and then going through these areas, painting them, and then deleting most of them with a brush that has some kind of texture and this opacity. So I'm putting the white down and then deleting most of it, just leaving a little bit so it can create this kind of focus. Usually, you choose this kind of colors like white or almost black, where you wanna, either paint almost blown out highlights or black for complete occlusion shadows. Another layer that I'm using here is color dots. As you can see, I'm gonna use it in the ear and the nose, creating even more the effect of the subsurface scattering. But be careful with this mode. It may change your values, so you may wanna go after the areas that you painted and choose a darker color to correct a little bit the values. Usually I use color dots, as I said, to create a little bit more subsurface scattering in the ear or the nose, to give the effect that there's a lot of light and the ear or the nose are kind of getting highlighted in the shadow areas by this overwhelming light. So the ear, for example, in this case, in this portrait, looks like a very, very, very reddish ear in the end, based on that mode. I'm gonna do a little bit more corrections here, like correcting a little bit more of the values, like on the neck, creating this darker triangle there and giving the impression that it's more of a 3D neck, right, like a round cylinder. And I'm gonna do now something that I call happy accidents. Is I'm picking up a color dots layer and experimenting around. This has nothing to do with skin tones, but it's more about creating some interests in the background, and kind of giving the impression that this is more like a painterly technique portrait. There is no need to do that, right? It's just styling effectively, because we're kind of towards at the end of the first portrait. But before we jump into the next one, I'm gonna give you a couple of more tips. One tip is you can see as much different areas here around the neck and the hair, in trying to give the impression that there is focus in the eyes and the face. And I'm also gonna start doing some post-processing stuff, like with levels. I'm gonna be creating more contrast by compacting the values, and I'm gonna be adjusting a little bit my highlights and shadows to push the shadows a little bit more to the red areas and highlights a little bit more to the green areas, just to create a little bit more color variations. These are all filters from Krita that you can do some post-processing. And then also I'm going to do the same with Gaussian blur, and blur even more the edges of the hair and the bottom of the shoulders and so on, just to create this vignette effect where you see hair mainly on hair, eyes and nose and lips. And effectively that was it. That's the first portrait that we have. That's the final result. And now slowly we can jump into the next example that I'm gonna show you, which is a lighter skin portrait. Let's see the process for the second portrait now. Similar to the first one, I'm gonna again color my line art so it can be easily blended with the rest of the portrait. The line art is going to be a little bit of a reddish color. Then I'm going to pick a lighter actual tone. For this one, we're going to see if I'm going to change it or not, but I'm going to first establish the shadows, and similar to the other one with a multiply layer, and then I'm going to make some adjustments if needed. My mid-tone is much redder than the one, because the challenge with this portrait is that almost everything is in the light or almost everything is in the shadow. That means there are very, very few midtones in this picture. Usually they are a little bit in the cheeks, in the transition between the light and the shadow. Since the light is so strong, you see how strong is this cast shadow from the face to the neck to the shoulder. It's almost like a straight line. That means it will create a lot of harsh shadows, which are good for learning to draw shadows, but it creates the difficulty, of course, that there is not so much midtones here. It's quite challenging to find the midtones. So I'm gonna choose this color and make my shadows, and then go a little bit more into shoulder anatomy by very, very slightly pushing my brush and creating some very, very light shadows in these areas. I don't want to push the contrast there at all, because as you can see, mainly we're talking about light areas. And having this knowledge and you know what's in the shadow or in the light, then I can judge a little bit better the midtones later. Still continuing the shadows, I'm gonna try and smudge some of the areas that are more form shadows and there shouldn't be that harsh, and leave more cast shadows areas, harsh edges, leave there the harsh edges, so I can have this, you know, contrast between lights and shadows. Yeah, effectively this is what I wanna be very careful with in this portrait, to not create so much contrast on the neck and the shoulders and the torso, right, and the chest in front, so I don't, you know, keep my contrast away from the rest of the areas. So about the light now, I'm gonna use again an overlay layer. I'm gonna put down a yellowish green color, just because I see the colors on the left are very, very, very desaturated. And then I'm gonna correct after that. After I have put the correct shapes and the values, then I'm gonna start massaging, let's say, the colors after the fact, when I'm ready to have all the light areas down effectively. So it's kind of a game of where you want to put the stronger lights and where you're choosing the stronger lights here in this portrait. That's the challenge with this one. Since everything is in the light, right, you want to make sure that you don't create flat areas, but you're kind of going through gradients of light and shadow in order to still capture that this is a real face and it's 3D in space and so on. So exactly, I'm going slowly, putting a lot of light values, but still considering to not put values of light in the midtones as much as possible. Also, I'm gonna, since it's kind of my style to make portraits much more colorful, I don't want to go that much desaturated as it in the reference, because effectively that would mean I'm kind of painting very, very close to grays, right, which is already the case as you can see the color selector, but at least there should be some color down, right, just because I like portraits being much more colorful here. I'm putting slowly some less let's say still areas that in the light, but a little bit less light bounces on them, and I'm going to be matching the different areas, creating these transitions that we have, for example, for the clavicle or for the chest, in order to have them appear that there is a continuation between each other, and there are all form shadows, so there is no hard edges and so on. So with this, I'm doing this with the smudge tool. Here I'm just going through the let's say the transition between the light and the shadow. I'm smudging either vertically or horizontally, depending on where the plane has this transition between each other. I'm gonna show you maybe in another video, maybe in a value more focused video, how you can do these transitions either through a brush, using a brush, or using the smudge tool as I'm using here. The faster way is with the smudge tool, of course, but it has the negative effect that if you want to paint more painterly, your brushes, your brush strokes, I'm sorry, will disappear. So it's kind of a give and take situation. Now already in the phase that I'm going into the rendering, I have established my base light and shadow areas, right? All the planes that are looking in the light are lighter, or the planes that are looking in the shadow are darker. I'm gonna put darker values by picking up the already established color and darken it by going more into the reds and more saturated. And my whole idea is to create, again, gradients between the established color and the darker color in order to give this impression of curvature in the face. That means that I'm going to create this kind of gradients by either smudging or picking up the color that I already have and mixing the colors together by blending with this brush. I usually don't use blender brushes. I prefer to have dry brushes and pick up colors with a color picker, and then create this kind of gradients by having a brush that I can with the opacity control how much color goes down into the digital canvas, and thus creating the gradients that I want. You can see already that even though I tried my best, still the contrast in the areas of the neck and the clavicle and the chest is higher than the reference to the left. We're gonna go through that a little bit later in the process and adjust this. I'm gonna show you how I'm adjusting this, but effectively I still want to keep the contrast there because it's easier to define all these values and the anatomy. Mainly this process with the rendering, I'm using normal layers. You may see me in the end use some other layers depending if I want to push colors into another hue or adjust a little bit the values, but usually I would use in the rendering phase a hard edge brush, either a round brush or this brush that I'm using now. It's more of a painterly brush, and kind of creating manually all the gradients that I want by first defining a shape and then blending it with the rest of the colors. So this is how I'm usually rendering and making stuff appear more 3D by just doing with a normal layer like I was going to paint, for example, traditionally. I like this process. It has been consistent for me and also allowing me to have more control over my colors because of course painting with layer modes makes a lot of stuff more easier, but also at the same time the application is holistic usually with these layers based on the layer functions, and that means if you want to go more into detail mode, it doesn't worth it to go through with layer modes in these areas. You're just gonna do it with a normal layer, at least for me. Effectively, it's all about creating these curvatures, picking up this small pockets of shadows where light doesn't go, like occlusion shadows, like how the actually the neck anatomy creates this actually pockets of shadows and creates this occlusion areas, or how here shoulder is turning back and it will be much darker, the shadow there. And now I'm going a little bit more into highlights, mainly since the whole reference is in the light. I'm gonna create a lot of highlights around the eyes or the forehead and create this transition to a very, very pale greenish yellow and up to the midtones, creating again the transition of something that is curved. Some areas, for example, are going to be darker, like the area of the nose between her eyes on the upper side, right where the keystone is in the forehead, but then the nose is going to be higher in value. Or the curvature of the shoulder here, or this highlight where the chest is starting, the muscle of the chest, or this upper side of the clavicle and the same side on the right. I'm going to create this highlights and then blend them out into the rest of the areas so I can create these gradients. When I go lighter, as we said, I'm going to go more into the yellow greens. When I go darker, I'm going to go more into the reds. Always having in mind, I'm going to shift my hue when I'm picking a color from the current canvas, and then moving either darker or lighter depending on the case. Yeah, and this is the whole process for rendering. So effectively getting smooth transitions, making sure stuff appear to be creating these gradients to make them more realistic, and having lines, slowly the lines of the sketch being hidden behind the painting. Some areas I want to make sure to keep them more less having hard edges, like the nose transition there you saw before. I'm gonna make her more feminine in that sense. Next time also to put the background there, I chose a much more colorful background. As you can see, went a little bit more stylistic on this one, just because having just a gray background was going to be making it boring. And then slowly going to the features by starting with the hair. Again, my brush strokes start from the roots of the hair and just follow the flow of the hair. And I'm not gonna be painting single hair, of course. I'm just painting locks and making sure that even if I do have some wrong brush strokes, I'm gonna leave them there to give the impression of actual hair that are going, from the root towards the flow, and they're not always predictable. I'm not gonna copy the hair that I'm seeing in the reference. I just want to make sure that I have a similar style, right? Like this kind of hairstyle that she has, which is locks of hair in front of her forehead, and then just some hair in the back, and make sure that I also look 3D by having, hair, since it's the light is coming from the left up right in front of here. As the hair go back, become darker and darker, and as they come forward, they are lighter and lighter. That's the main principle here, and making sure that I have some shapes of light and shadow that create the illusion of the hair. Again, mainly curved triangles, as you can see here. This is like my favorite shape, and I'm choosing mainly normal layers by going from dark red, which is the shadow areas or the occlusion sides of the hair, towards light oranges colors for light and highlights, right? This is the same thinking as the skin. One more thing I'm doing in the hair, I'm gonna pick an airbrush and then do a band of light, a horizontal band, and then I'm gonna cut into it with a specific hard edge brush to create the illusion of highlights. And the last thing I did is I used a color dots layer to give a little bit more color into the highlights themselves by using a darker orange color. Now I'm going through a color layer or soft light layer, and I may use color layer sometimes. That's why I mentioned color layer, but at this time I'm using soft light layer to create the illusion of makeup. You may want to do it, you may not want to do it, depending on how you want to style your portraits. If the reference has makeup, I just chose to do it here just to show you how you can approach these situations. Like, you put first your values and so on, and then you can go with a soft light layer and kind of adjust the colors to be closer to your reference. It can also be done with a color layer, although you may want with a color layer to then go on top and adjust the colors of the shadows, because the color layer will nullify all the colors you have underneath it. So I prefer sometimes to have soft light layer to kind of have some colors still remain there, because soft light layer will interact with the actual colors underneath it and just shift them a little bit towards the color you want. Similar to the previous portrait, I'm just going through the lips, just making sure that I get the shadow areas on the top lips and where the two lips touch each other, where it's the, the darker values there, and also at the same time making sure that the bottom lip has the highlights that is needed. The whole idea is, as we said, is we're going to put highlights on the transition of the bottom lip to the skin. Then the opposite of the transition of the top lip to the skin, there should be a darker area as the lips curve into the mouth, right? That's the two things that make the lips transition well into the skin. The top transitions into the skin towards the bottom, so the curvature is downwards, and the bottom lip transitions upwards into the skin, so the curvature is upwards. So highlight on the bottom, darker on the top compared to other planes. And small white areas on the lips, on the bottom lips, to create this effect of having highlights on the lips effectively. Let me know in the comments if you want to deep dive into the lips and how you paint them. It's not quite complicated as it seems, but it's quite simplified if you understand the structure of the lips, and when you do it a few times, it's gonna be easy after this. I'm just making sure still to have some transition in the lips between the skin, and now I'm gonna go through the eyes. Effectively, we're not seeing so much of the eyes. I'm gonna just put some blues there. I don't want to go that high into the values of the eyes, because the eyes are mainly I'm talking about the eyeball inside the eyes is mainly in the shadow, right? So I'm gonna make sure that the eyes are dark enough because she barely has her eyes open, and that means that I don't want to put something like white there. I mean, anyways, you don't want to put white in the eyes. You want to kind of get enough pale color, like magenta pale color in the mid-tones, or a bluish pale color for the eyes. And as you can see, mainly the eyes, I'm just even making them even darker, giving the impression that they are almost close and is looking down. I'm doing some reflective light now with normal layer, and pretty much going a little bit less saturated to give the impression of bluish pale light. So if you pick a color around the red areas or the yellow areas and you desaturate it, you're gonna see the effect that it appears to be more blue. Or if you pick a color from the yellow bandwidth and you desaturate it, you're gonna see it transitioning into the greens more. So these are some ways you can make the colors appear more blue, even though if you go and select them with a color picker, you will find out that they're actually red, right? Now we're going to do with a soft light layer, as in the other portrait, a lot of subsurface scattering in the nose, in the transition of the shadow, in the cheek, right? I'm gonna make sure that there is a lot of redness in these areas because we don't have a lot of midtones, as I had said in the portrait. And the important thing is we want to make the colors that we still have in these transition areas pop a lot, so they can, completely make up for the lack of color in the areas in the light, effectively. That's why I'm pushing the colors so much. And then again, when I put the subsurface scattering effects, then I'm gonna go on top and paint with darker colors in the nostrils or some other areas where the light is less. And what I'm doing now is going through the light areas, and especially what I did before in the neck is try to lower the contrast in the neck in the light areas, effectively making it less contrasty there, because I don't want people to be seeing this area. It's not that important. The importance is the area of the face, right? So we're gonna make sure we kind of follow the reference in this area and have very little contrast. Finally, the eyebrows, which are kind of a little bit of a darker color than the hair. I just chose this color. Her eyebrows are quite light, but I wanted to make sure that they are kind of visible here to point towards the eyes. So that's why I chose this darker color. And finally, I'm doing a hard light layer, doing a little bit of rim light to enhance the backlight, reflected light that I created before with this bluish, let's say, layer. I'm gonna desaturate it a little bit more, and I'm just gonna leave it there. It's not completely correct in terms of reality, but I just wanted to create this effect of a backlight. And now I'm gonna be doing some final, let's say, almost white, as we said, highlights, this time with color dots, and then also with a normal layer on top, just to give some impression of highlights, and create these focus areas, especially in here eyelids, for example. And what I'm doing now is with the lasso tool, I'm gonna be painting the drops where she's crying, and I'm gonna be doing this by choosing a normal layer and choosing colors from the already existing painting, and just creating basically mostly shadows and occlusion shadows from this. Effectively, what you wanna make sure you have is the occlusion shadows to paint water here, and the highlights, and nothing else. And everything else will be picked up by your brain and will create this impression that it's seeing water, right? So you don't want to be painting anything with other colors. Just make sure you paint the occlusion shadows and the shadows on the left and the highlights on the right top, and this will create immediately the effect that you're seeing, this teardrop in the cheek dropping down. So this is how you can do teardrops running through the face with a very simple and fast technique. Yeah, so giving out the focus on this one, I just wanted to be more like the highlight. And finally, painting this stranded hair from her hair into the cheek. This is usually stuff that you should be leaving for the end, right? You don't want to be painting this hair early and then trying to paint around this hair all the time, trying not to smudge them and so on. This kind of planning your different areas of painting before you go ahead and paint any details in that matter, like we are, for example, we're doing the features, and as we're leaving them towards the end of the process. And now we are more into what I call post-processing, steps like smudging some edges of the hair or creating some interesting effects like before, for example, some textured random highlights to create some effects of camera lens effects, for example, going again through the curves and the colors, some Gaussian blur to blur some areas that I don't want to be really in focus. Mainly I want her face to be in focus, as we did with the other portraits, and we are done effectively. That's the second portrait. Alright everyone, these were the 2 examples of painting portraits that we saw. I hope you found this video useful. As always, if you like this video, make sure you like it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't, because it really helps in spreading the word to other fellow artists. If you have any questions, make sure you leave them in the comments. I will be glad to communicate with you and help you as much as possible. And as always, see you in the next one.